So let's look at how we can get from jQuery to using VanillaJS, and then eventually looking at some equivalent reactive JavaScript using a little framework called Alpine. I have here the classic, you may not have seen this before, but in a lot of reactive JavaScript projects, the Hello World project is a little counter that you can increase and decrease. So we're going to start with this. I've got some HTML where I've got a counter in a heading. I've got a paragraph containing the current count, and then I've got two buttons here. Very, very simple. I've styled it in some CSS, and we're going to write some JavaScript to try and make it work. So we're going to start off with jQuery, and to do that in CodePen, where I'm working, we can, how do we do this? We search here for jQuery, and we can just click that, and it adds that to our project. So let's save that, and we should now be able to use the $version of jQuery, and we want to, what is it we want to do? So we want to get this button, and when this button is clicked, we want to increase the count. So we want to find the add button. Let's just make this a little bit wider like this. So the add button has an ID of add, so we're going to look for #add, and then when that is clicked, do that with click, we're going to run a function like so. And what we're going to do in this function, well, when we click the button, we are going to get the counter. So let's get the counter. And now how we're going to do this, there's a couple of ways of doing this. So the sort of brute force way is to say, well, counter has some, is it text in it? And we can maybe save that to a variable. So we'll let count equals that. And then we will do $counter.text. And I think we pass in count plus 1. Now, thank you CodePen for the reminder. Let's just see what happens, because something weird is going to happen, I think. We'll see why. Yeah, so it's concatenating strings here. So we actually want to do, up here, maybe we'll do parseInt to change that text into a number. Is that going to work? Yeah, there we go. So that's our add button working, and then we can copy all of this, make a copy of it, and this is the subtract button, and we're going to do the same thing but with a minus. That's fine. Just let it figure that out. So we should now be able to do, yeah, so that's all working. And this is a really common pattern in JavaScript, and the common pattern that jQuery helps a lot with is where you are grabbing an interface element, and then you're saying when some event happens, like a click, then we find some other interface element, and we change something about that other interface element. And that's exactly what's going on here. Like, sure, we can tidy this up a bit. We can store the counter rather than repeatedly fetch it. So we can do let counter lm equals, well, actually in jQuery it's kind of, some people use $ to denote jQuery objects. So we can do that, and then wherever we've got, get this up a little bit, wherever we need to use that, we can just reference counter. And, you know, this saves a bit of time because we're only crawling the DOM once to find the ID, but it's going to be a minimal, like, performance saving. But, you know, okay, so hopefully that, what's it really, oh no, I've got an error. What have I done? What's my error? Got an unexpected token. Yeah, there we go. Great, so that's all still working. The other thing we could do is we could store the counter value here and just assume that that's the same initial value, and we could then, instead of grabbing the value, we can, I don't know if you know this, but if you put plus plus or minus minus on the end of a variable, that will add one or subtract one. So we can do that. And then we've got our state of the system stored here, and then we're just using the state to update. And that's all working too. So that's a slightly different way of doing it. So there's a couple of ways of doing it in jQuery, but this basic pattern of grab an element, add some event handler to the element, and when you click that, it updates some other element on the page. It's a really common pattern, and we'll come back to reference that again when we look at Alpine. So the issue with this is if I open my DevTools, and we will, as CodePen suggests, save this. It's good. And then in my network tab, I'm in Firefox, but it's very similar. We can search through our requests for jQuery and see how big jQuery is. So in order to do this with jQuery, we are loading, make it a bit bigger, we're transferring nearly 30 kilobytes of JavaScript, and that's expanding uncompressed to nearly 90 kilobytes of JavaScript. So yeah, it's like a not insubstantial amount of framework code just to do this stuff. And this is the main reason that we might want to get rid of jQuery. So let's get rid of jQuery. We can remove it from here. Of course, everything's going to break, I would hope. We'll probably get some errors yet because, well, $'s not defined. Okay, so how do we do this in vanilla JavaScript? Because you can do this all in vanilla JavaScript perfectly well these days. So this getting an element by its ID, we can do that using JavaScript function called document get element by ID, and we'll just pass it counter. So that will then fetch the counter element. It's not jQuery anymore, it's a counter element. And then same here, we're getting an element by ID, and the ID in this case is add. And then we don't have the click method for adding an event handler. We need to add event listener. Now I'm not going to explain how all this works with vanilla JavaScript. I'll leave that as an exercise for you. I'm just showing you that it can be done and that it's not too difficult. But I guess essentially this gets our element, and then the element that we get has this add event listener method or function that we can call on it. And add event listener takes an event name, which will be click, and very similar, it takes a function, and drop the counter value. So we're gonna let's add that. Let's leave that in actually. So we're gonna increment the counter value. Make sure we let and declare that properly. And now we've got the counter element. And we don't have .text, but we do have inner text. And that then should be the plus button working, I hope. No, it's because we still don't have $. I'm going to comment that out. Hopefully that removes the error. No, still don't like it. See, no, I don't get this right first time. Oh yes, we don't. This isn't a function. This is actually a value. So we can just set it like so. Still in my old jQuery ways sometimes. Great. Now we have a working counter, and then we can delete the subtract code, copy this here, and paste it down here. So we've got two copies of this. This is going to be the subtract ID, and we're going to subtract instead of add. Great. So we now should have a working counter again, but this is entirely in vanilla JavaScript. So we've saved ourselves that 96 kilobytes of loading, and sure thing, like document.getElement by ID is a bit of a long thing to type, but we've increased a little bit of writing inside our JavaScript, but we've saved ourselves 96 kilobytes of stuff. So now let's look at how we can take this, grab an element, and an action on this element affects some other element. Let's see how AlpineJS, which is a small framework, helps us by changing this into what I would call reactive JavaScript code. And we'll see the reactive principle at work. So let's comment out all the JavaScript, and in the JavaScript settings we'll add Alpine and save the project. Now clearly this will break our counter because we don't have anything going on anymore. Now weirdly, we're going to do all of our coding up here in the HTML. And the way that this works is, like we had the counter value piece of state, we will declare that there is some state within our HTML, and we do that using xData equals, and then in here we're going to put a JavaScript object with the state that we are remembering. So this will be our counter value, and its initial value will be 0. And then what we'll do in our counter, where we're actually displaying this value, we'll delete the 0, and as an attribute on this element we will use xText. And xText says the text inside this element will be the result of whatever this expression is. So I might just put a string in here, for example, and that gets displayed. But I can also use a variable from the state data that we declared. So I can put counter value in here, and that appears. I can also put counter value plus 1, and this is an expression, so this gets evaluated, and the result of this little expression gets put as the text inside my paragraph. And when we say that this is reactive, what we mean is that when this value changes, anywhere that it's used will automatically be updated. So this is how we achieve the display. If I change this here to 1, that gets updated. So there's what Alpine does is it creates this link between uses of the state and changes to the state. So we're not managing the fetching of all the stuff and the putting in of all the stuff. It's all being handled for us automatically. What we can then do on the button, so let's tackle the add button first. We can say x on :click. This again is an HTML attribute, and anything that within the value of that attribute, we will put an expression again, and this expression will be evaluated whenever this item is clicked. So we could put console.log yay in here and open the console. There is a console. There is a console. Yes. Hopefully, when I click this, there you go, it's printing yay to the console. So the code in here basically gets run when we click. And this can refer to, the code in here can refer to the data that we have. So I can take the counter value and increment it. Let's close the console, and now, here we go. So that's like magic. I've written no JavaScript whatsoever other than a couple of expressions and creating an object up here. But all inside my HTML, I've said, when you click this button, increment the counter value variable within our state. And because this is all like cleverly linked together by Alpine, the display automatically updates. And all of the getting and setting is all handled for us. All we've said is, here's some data, here's where that data is used and displayed, and here's what happens when this button is clicked. And when we say it's reactive, the display reacts to the things that we are doing. this is a really neat way of doing some of this code, or this type of coding within JavaScript. So again, here we can do x on click equals counter value minus minus. So we subtract 1 from the counter value, and here's our working counter. We've written no JavaScript whatsoever. All we've done is expressed what we call declaratively. We've said, here's what should happen, here's what should be displayed, and Alpine has taken care of the rest of it for us. Just to be clear, let's save this, open up DevTools, and reload the project. Like, we are again loading a JavaScript framework here. So if I search in here for Alpine, make it a bit bigger, this is our Alpine library being loaded. We're transferring, I think it's about 10 kilobytes less compressed content, but it's expanding to, again, about 90 kilobytes of actual JavaScript that's being run and evaluated. But this gives us so much more power and works in such a very different kind of way to jQuery and vanilla JavaScript that hopefully you can start to see how powerful this is. Just to finish off, let's show you how we can tap into some more of Alpine's power. I'm going to create a new button called... we don't need these IDs because they don't... we're not having to grab stuff out of the DOM. We're not having to get these elements and reference them directly because we're avoiding that entirely using Alpine. But we will call this x2. And when this runs, we're going to imagine that we've got a function called double. And of course this doesn't work because we haven't created a function called double. And we have to jump through a little bit of a hoop to do this. So let's go and visit the AlpineJS documentation. And so this takes us through some installation, talks about state and how you can declare data, very much as we did. Now I'm looking for how we can use what's called reusable data. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of this. I'm just going to copy this code snippet, actually include the script tags. For complicated reasons that I won't go into, this needs to go inside our HTML here rather than down here. But what this does is this says, when Alpine initializes, we're going to run a function, just as like an initializer constructor type thing. This is going to declare some data. It will be called counter data. And it will have the following sort of properties. So we're now working inside a JavaScript object. So we're using keys and values. We will have the counter value, and its initial value will be 0. And I'm going to comment out toggle because we'll come back to this in a moment. Now, because I've declared this counter to be called counter data, I'm going to reference that in my X data here instead. Again, I'm just showing you, don't worry too much about the syntax and how it all hangs together. It's well documented on the Alpine site. So when I'm saying X data here is counter data, I'm now referring to this sort of data object thing that I'm creating. Is that all working? We're all still working. That's good. And this object here can have methods associated with it. So we said, imagine there was a double method here. We can declare that here. We can say double is some function which takes the counter value, multiplies it by 2, and reassigns it back to counter value. So literally just going to double the counter value. And then we're calling this function here whenever we click on this button. So this isn't going to do anything with a 0, but if I go to 1, I can then, okay, what didn't work? I need to refer to this .counter value because I'm inside the object. Hopefully that works. Do 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. So we're now doubling. The power of this is that we can create a bunch of methods in here, which can do various different things. And because they're methods, they don't just have to be one-liners. So this expression in here has to be like a single thing that you can do, but I can now put some complex business logic in here inside a method, inside a function, and so I can do, as well as that, I can console.log the new value if we want to, like that, and these functions can do whatever logic we need to do. And you'll note that my update to counter value is happening inside this function, but it's still being reactive. It's still updating where we're using the counter value in the body of the HTML. So this is a really powerful way of programming. It allows us to be much more simply expressive about the business logic that we want to do, about the actions that we want to take, and how we want to use the data without having to engage in all this getting and setting stuff from the DOM. So we are freed from the thing that jQuery originally made easy for us in order to spend more time thinking about, well, what is it I'm actually trying to achieve here? So it's a much more expressive way of doing this. I have skipped over a lot. I have maybe made some assumptions about how much you know about JavaScript and HTML, but hopefully this made some kind of sense and was a good overview of how we can move from jQuery to VanillaJS, and then maybe what the benefits of using a reactive library like Alpine is. Just to finish, Alpine is a really good example of a reactive JavaScript library. It's based heavily on Vue.js, which is spelt Vue. Alpine is like a cut down version of Vue. You'll also see React, but React requires you to write a very different style, but it effectively works in the same kind of way. React automatically updates values and sort of synchronizes the state and the display of stuff in your project or your component, but is a bit more sort of codey and programmery, and you need to write more code to make it happen. So hopefully this was useful, and let me know if you have any questions or want me to take it further.